If you are here tonight, listening with the quiet intensity of someone who has carried more than their share of invisible burdens, then I must tell you something before we begin the collapse. Your fear was never the end. It was the initiation. The empath does not shatter because they are weak. They shatter because their soul insists on a deeper truth than the one they have been living. And before an empath rises, life often brings them into a silence so profound it feels like disappearance. Yet this disappearance is sacred. It is the womb of transformation, the chamber in which the unconscious rearranges the fragments of identity that no longer serve the soul. When I speak of collapse, I do not mean the dramatic falling apart you might imagine in a story. I mean the soft implosion inside you when you realize that the life you built was constructed around the emotions of others. I mean the exhaustion that comes not from giving too much, but from never giving to yourself. Empaths collapse quietly because they have been quietly wounded. And they rise quietly because their rising is not for performance, it is for truth. There is an old pattern I have observed in many sensitive souls. They adapt so thoroughly to the world that they forget they were not meant to adapt to it. But to transform it, the empath becomes too attuned to the suffering of others, and in doing so, disconnects from their own inner fire, like a candle lighting every corner of a dark room except the place where it stands. They become invisible in their own life. That invisibility is not weakness, it is unconsciousness. And the moment unconsciousness reaches its limit, collapse arrives. But collapse is the psyche's way of saying, return to yourself. The unconscious does not speak in sentences or arguments, it speaks in symbols, in fatigue, in dreams that unsettle you at dawn. I have met empaths who told me they felt like they were dying, yet their bodies were healthy. What was withering was their false self, the persona shaped by childhood patterns, by parental wounds, by the archetype of the caretaker that never learned how to receive. The collapse is the soul breaking the mask. You must understand, every empath carries an archetypal function. The empath is the bridge between worlds, the realm of feeling and the realm of meaning. The conscious and the shadow, the seen and the unseen, their body is the vessel through which collective emotions pass. But no vessel can endlessly hold what has never been emptied. Eventually, the forgotten self demands to be remembered. And when that moment comes, the collapse is not an accident. It is the revelation that you cannot continue living as the version of you that survived the past. Survival is not living, it is postponement. It is breathing underwater, waiting for the moment you finally rise to the surface. And the empath's quietest collapse is the moment the water becomes too heavy to bear. I once worked with a woman who dreamed every night of an enormous black sea stretching infinitely before her. She told me she always stood at the shore, feeling the weight of something ancient beneath the waves. She feared stepping into it, yet she felt drawn to it. What she did not realize was that the sea was her unconscious, vast, deep, and filled with emotions she had never claimed as her own. Her collapse came when she finally could no longer pretend the sea was not calling her, and her rising began the moment she understood that the sea was not meant to drown her. but to cleanse her. Empaths collapse because they have carried emotions that do not belong to them. They rise when they finally discern the difference. There is a moment, every empath knows it, when you look at someone you tried so hard to love, to save, to understand, and you realize the connection was built on your ability to absorb their suffering. You see the imbalance, the emotional contract you never consciously agreed to, and in that moment, something inside you breaks. It is not the heart that breaks, it is the illusion. That breaking is necessary. The psyche cannot build a new foundation without first demolishing the old structure, but understand something deeper. The empath's collapse is not merely psychological, it is archetypal. It is the collapse of the wounded healer, the moment when the healer must heal themselves. Shirong, the ancient archetype of the healer, was wounded not by malice but by destiny. His wound forced him to turn inward, to learn the medicine born from suffering. The empath follows the same path. Your collapse is the moment you confront the truth that you cannot heal the world if you are disappearing inside your own life. There is a profound loneliness that accompanies this collapse. It is not the loneliness of being alone, it is the loneliness of having outgrown the world you once felt responsible for. When an empath begins to awaken, they no longer fit into the emotional patterns that once defined them. They stop rescuing, they stop absorbing, they stop apologizing for their sensitivity. And in that transition, they feel like a stranger to everyone, including themselves. This is the chrysalis phase of the psyche. The caterpillar does not simply change shape, it dissolves into formlessness before becoming a butterfly. The empath must dissolve too into silence, into introspection, into the truth. They avoid it while trying to hold everyone else's emotions together. Collapse is the dissolution, rising is the emergence, but the rising cannot be forced. It is not an act of willpower, it is an act of surrender. The self you are becoming is not built by effort. It is revealed by letting go of the self you no longer are. Many empaths try to rise too quickly. They attempt to return to their old strength, their old optimism, their old capacity to carry others, but the psyche does not allow you to rise into the past. It only allows you to rise into the future, and the future demands authenticity. The collapse strips away everything in you that was built on pleasing others. It removes the identities you wore for survival. It dissolves the emotional contracts built on silence and self-sacrifice. When you collapse, you are being purified. This quiet collapse feels like a betrayal of your old self, yet it is the greatest act of loyalty to your true self. Let me tell you something that many empaths resist hearing. You cannot rise until you finally admit that you are angry. Anger is the shadow of the empath. It is the repressed fire that keeps the psyche from splitting in half. An empath who never acknowledges their anger becomes spiritually exhausted. They lose boundaries. They lose clarity. They lose the ability to say no. Anger is not destructive. It is protective. It is the inner lion that has been asleep for years. The collapse awakens the lion. In dreams, empaths often see animals at the moment their psyche is preparing for a breakthrough wolves. Lions, serpents, and enormous birds. These animals symbolize instinct, power, and the forces of the unconscious returning to consciousness if the animal is wounded or caged. It means your own instincts have been suppressed. If the animal is breaking free, it means you are on the verge of reclaiming your power. And when the empath rises from their quietest collapse, they do not rise as the soft caretaker the world once knew. They rise as the one who finally sees through illusion. They rise with a serenity that comes not from innocence but from initiation. Their empathy becomes discerning. Their compassion becomes protected. Their heart becomes wise. The empath rises when they realize that saving themselves is the highest service they can offer to the world. Your collapse is not your downfall, it is your turning point. It is the door to your next identity. It is the moment your soul chooses itself after years of choosing others. You will not remain in this dissolution. You are becoming the version of you that carries empathy and boundaries, intuition and strength, softness and fire. This rising will not look like what you expect. It will be quiet, steady, almost imperceptible at first. You will notice it in the way your body begins to relax around certain people and tense around others. You will feel it in the silence that once felt terrifying but now feels sacred. You will hear it in the whisper of your unconscious saying, "Now you know who you are." The empath is about to rise not by becoming more of what they were, but by becoming who they were meant to be before the world taught them to betray themselves. When the empath enters this phase of collapse, there is often a moment that feels both terrifying and strangely liberating. It is the moment when the self realizes it has run out of borrowed identities. You can no longer pretend to be the version of you that survived childhood wounds. You can no longer maintain the persona that once kept the peace, absorbed chaos, or soothed the emotional turbulence of others. And though there is fear in this dissolution, there is also truth. The psyche is cleansing itself of adaptations that were never natural to your spirit. I have said many times that neurosis is the suffering of a soul that has not yet discovered its meaning. For the empath, collapse is a neurosis born of self-abandonment. It is what happens when you spend years carrying the emotions of others while silencing your own inner voice. And yet, meaning waits patiently behind the suffering. The collapse is the doorway to meaning because it forces you into confrontation with the parts of yourself that you have long exiled into the unconscious. Empaths often tell me that during their darkest period, they feel as though they have disappeared from their own life. Their energy drops, their clarity evaporates, and their relationships begin to feel strangely distant. It is as if the world they once carried on their shoulders suddenly becomes too heavy to lift. What they do not realize is that this sensation is not the end. It is the psyche withdrawing energy from the false self so that it can return to the true one. In this withdrawal, your dreams may become unusually vivid. You may see symbols of descent falling through tunnels, wandering through abandoned houses, walking underground, being submerged in water. These are the dreams of a soul entering its shadow. They are not warnings. They are invitations. The unconscious does not harm you. It seeks to show you the lost pieces of yourself. The empath's collapse is simply the moment when the inner descent becomes unavoidable. One patient once described a recurring dream in which she stood before a mirror, but the reflection looked nothing like her. The reflected figure was older, stronger, almost fierce, and her eyes were filled with a wisdom that frightened her. The dream unsettled her, yet it was the beginning of her rising. She had been living as the soft, accommodating version of herself her entire life. The woman in the mirror was the archetype of her true self, an intuitive, discerning, emotionally sovereign being she had not yet allowed herself to become. The empath's quietest collapse is the precise moment when this inner archetype begins pressing against the walls of your consciousness, demanding recognition, and once the archetype awakens, the rising becomes inevitable. But rising is not an upward motion. It does not begin with action. It begins with awareness. It begins with the realization that the people you once felt responsible for are no longer aligned with the person you are becoming. You begin to see the emotional contracts with stunning clarity. You recognize the roles you played in relationships not because you were weak, but because your empathy was unaccompanied by boundaries. You begin to understand that love without self-respect becomes self-sacrifice, and self-sacrifice without limit becomes self-erasure. The collapse is the death of self-erasure, and so the rising is the birth of self-presence. There is a moment when the empath sits in their quiet room after the collapse, staring into the emptiness that once terrified them, and suddenly something shifts. The silence no longer feels like punishment, it feels like space. The solitude no longer feels like abandonment, it feels like truth. The stillness no longer feels like paralysis, it feels like a sanctuary. This is the first sign of your rising. The inner world becomes more real than the outer world. For many years, you believed that your value came from your impact on others. The empath's identity was intertwined with their ability to soothe, to heal, to understand. But now, in this sacred quiet, you begin to encounter the self without performance. You begin to feel emotions that were long buried beneath responsibility. You begin to sense that your intuition, once drowned out by the noise of other people's needs, is returning with a clearer voice. This returning intuition is not gentle, it is precise, sharp, sometimes uncomfortably honest. It will show you where your boundaries were unguarded. It will show you who drained your energy without remorse. It will show you the truth of relationships that were built not on reciprocity, but on your emotional labor. The empath rises when they finally see clearly. But clarity is not the end of the journey. It is only the beginning. You will begin to feel a subtle shift in your emotional body. The fatigue that weighed you down begins to feel lighter, not because the world has changed, but because the weight of carrying others has lifted from your shoulders. You will notice that you are no longer as reactive to the moods of those around you. You begin to realize that your sensitivity was never meant to be an open wound. It was meant to be a finely tuned instrument. Every empath must learn this sensitivity is not fragility. Sensitivity is perception. When the empath has collapsed, sensitivity feels like drowning. But after the rising begins, sensitivity becomes clarity. You begin to sense the emotions of others, not as your responsibility, but as information. The psychic boundary that was once porous begins to strengthen. This is the moment when the empath begins to reclaim power, not through confrontation, but through discernment. Discernment is the empath's true weapon. It is the ability to feel everything but absorb nothing. It is the ability to love deeply without abandoning oneself. It is the ability to walk into the emotional storms of others without losing your center. This newfound discernment is not learned intellectually. It emerges organically from the collapse when the false self dissolves. The empath returns to their original essence, a soul capable of sensing truth beyond words, feeling the unconscious beneath the surface of interactions, and navigating life with an intuition sharper than logic. But before this power becomes fully accessible, there is a stage. Every empath goes through a stage that feels like emotional purging. You may cry without knowing why. You may feel waves of grief rising unexpectedly. You may sense old memories resurfacing as if the unconscious is opening its archives. This is not regression, it is cleansing. The collapse brings you into the underworld of your psyche, but the rising brings the underworld up into the light. You are not being destroyed, you are being rewoven. I once told a patient whose collapse lasted nearly a year, your psyche is dismantling everything that is not truly yours. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "But if I let go of all of that, what will be left of me?" I answered, "Only you, and that is enough." The rising requires this surrender. You must release what you constructed to survive, so that the self meant to thrive can finally emerge. You will begin to notice a change in your dreams once the rising truly begins. The symbols shift. Instead of wandering through darkness, you may find yourself walking toward a distant light. Instead of being chased, you may discover that you are the one who turns around unafraid. Instead of drowning, you find yourself floating, carried by waves rather than crushed by them. Dreams are the psyche's way of announcing transformation before the conscious mind catches up. The rising becomes visible in your waking life too. You will speak with more certainty. You will say no with less guilt. You will choose solitude without feeling lonely. And you will sense people's intentions not through analysis, but through instinct. This is the empath entering the archetype of the sovereign self. It is a powerful shift. The empath who once sought validation from others begins to validate themselves. The empath who once lowered their needs to maintain peace begins to raise their standards to maintain integrity. The empath who once suppressed their anger begins to use it as a compass, pointing toward what is misaligned. Your collapse taught you what must end. Your rising teaches you what must begin. But let me tell you something important. The rising does not end with power. It ends with peace. The empath does not rise to dominate, to harden, or to numb their sensitivity. They rise to embody their essence without losing themselves. And there is a moment, quiet, sacred, when you will feel something in your chest expand, a warmth, a clarity, a knowing. You will realize that your collapse was not a failure, it was a return to the self you abandoned long ago, a return to the instincts you silenced, a return to the truth you once feared. The empath rises when they understand that their sensitivity is not a curse from the world, it is a calling from the soul. As the empath begins to rise, a subtle transformation unfolds, one that cannot be seen from the outside, but can be profoundly felt within. It is not dramatic, it is not loud, it does not announce itself with triumphant declarations or glorious awakenings. Instead, it comes as a quiet recalibration, like the shifting of inner tectonic plates. It is the moment the psyche rearranges itself around a new center, your center. For years, perhaps decades, you orbited around the emotional needs of others. Your psyche revolved around their storms, their wounds, their expectations. You thought this was love. You thought this was empathy. But now, as you rise from your collapse, you finally recognize the difference between compassion and self-abandonment. This recognition comes slowly, sometimes painfully, as if you are waking from a dream you didn't realize you were trapped in. You look at your past relationships with new eyes, and it is almost shocking how clearly you now see the patterns that once held you captive. You see the emotional labor you performed in silence. You see the boundaries you never placed. You see the person you pretended to be so that others would not feel threatened by your sensitivity or intimidated by your intuition. This clarity is not cruelty, it is consciousness. The empath's rising begins with this moment of self-awareness, a piercing, unfiltered understanding of your own participation in your suffering. It is not the world that betrayed you. It was your belief that you must sacrifice yourself for love. And once you see this truth, you cannot unsee it. Your unconscious begins to speak more clearly now. Dreams become more symbolic, more direct. Dissolved fragments of your identity start to integrate. Memories you had forgotten return, not to harm you, but to free you from the illusions you once built around them. The psyche does not bring back the past to punish you. It brings it back so you may reclaim the parts of yourself that were trapped there. Many empaths during this stage tell me they feel a strange sense of detachment from the world. They are not numb. They are not dissociating. They are transitioning. They are learning to feel from within, not through others. This shift can feel disorienting at first, but it is the beginning of sovereignty. Imagine standing in a room filled with people whose emotions once dictated your movements. You would immediately feel their tension, their needs, their insecurities, and you would adjust yourself like water pouring into the shape of its container. But now, as you rise, something different happens. Instead of flowing outward, your energy begins to gather inward. You feel your own presence more strongly. You sense a boundary, not a wall, but a membrane forming between you and the world. This boundary is the birth of your psychic independence. In this stage of rising, you may find that certain people begin to react strangely to you. They sense a shift in the dynamic, even if they cannot articulate it. The empath, who once quietly absorbed everything, is no longer energetically available. You are no longer predictable. You are no longer complacent. Your inner world is no longer open for others to dump their unresolved darkness into. People who once depended on your emotional labor may grow uncomfortable. They may accuse you of changing. They may say you have become distant or cold. But this is not coldness, it is consciousness. You are simply no longer offering yourself as an emotional sponge to the unconscious of others. This is threatening, but to your own soul, this is liberation. This rising is not a rebellion, it is a homecoming. You are returning to the center of your own psyche, reclaiming the throne you abandoned long ago. In Jungian psychology, this is the individuation process, the gradual alignment of the conscious and unconscious mind, the emergence of a unified self, no longer pulled by the emotions of others. You begin to sense your own inner archetypes more clearly. The archetype of the healer softens. The archetype of the parent releases its grip, and in the space that opens, a new archetype rises, the archetype of the warrior of sensitivity. Do not mistake this warrior for aggression. This warrior fights not to dominate others, but to preserve the sanctity of your inner life. This warrior defends your intuition. This warrior protects your quiet. This warrior refuses to let you collapse again in the same way you once did. And as this inner warrior awakens, something extraordinary begins to happen. Your energy starts returning, slowly, gently, like a tide coming back after a long retreat. Your vitality rises, your mind becomes clearer, your breath deepens, your body feels lighter. You begin to sense a subtle power flowing beneath your sensitivity, a strength that does not shout or demand, but simply is. This is the empath's inner fire. It was always there, hidden beneath layers of self-sacrifice and unconscious guilt. But now that you are no longer dissolving into others, it has room to burn, and its flame illuminates the truth of your path. You were not meant to be drained by your empathy. You were meant to be guided by it. For the first time, in a long time, you begin to desire things not for others, but for yourself. You crave authenticity. You crave inner alignment. You crave relationships that nourish rather than deplete you. You crave a life that feels like a mirror of your soul, not an echo of other people's wounds. This craving is sacred. It is the compass of the rising empath. During this stage, you may feel a deep hunger for solitude, not to isolate, but to integrate. Solitude becomes a temple. The noise of the world becomes distracting. The drama of others becomes irrelevant. You begin to realize that most of your suffering came from living in environments where your sensitivity was misunderstood, minimized, or exploited. And so you choose silence not because you are breaking, but because you are becoming. The empath rising looks like stillness to the outside world, but inside, the psyche is reorganizing itself into a new configuration. Your unconscious is rewriting your story. Your shadow is revealing its wisdom. Your ego, once overextended, begins to relax. You are no longer at war within. You are aligning. At this stage, a profound emotional intelligence emerges, one that is not based on rescuing or absorbing, but on perceiving truth. You begin to sense the hidden motivations of others. You see the wounds behind their words. You recognize when someone's affection is genuine and when it is manipulative. You understand the difference between connection and attachment. You no longer romanticize suffering. You no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. This clarity is a gift of your collapse. And then something even deeper happens. The empath begins to forgive themselves. You stop blaming yourself for the ways you were used, misunderstood, or taken for granted. You stop punishing yourself for being too sensitive, too loving, too intuitive. You stop seeing your past as a failure. Instead, you see it as initiation. Every collapse is an initiation. When the empath rises, they do not rise as the person they were before the collapse. They rise as someone who has walked through the underworld of their own unconscious, someone who has faced the shadows that once controlled them, someone who has learned to differentiate between compassion and self-sacrifice, someone who no longer fears the intensity of their own depth. They rise as someone who is finally whole. And wholeness, for the empath, is not about perfection. It is about integration. It is about embracing every part of you that you once exiled.